I'm really interested in your opinion as to, you know so much about these two racecourses. If you had to pick, who would be the main person that stands out for you in either Hurst Park or Sandown's history, and why?
I think the main person probably at Sandown is, of course, Hoofer Williams, because he was the one who came up with the concept of enclosed race courses, which became the blueprint for all of the modern courses we know today. As there are still a few of the old ones that still exist, but all the modern enclosed ones are very much down to the trend that Hoofer Williams started with his initiative. At Sandown Park, at Hurst Park, I picked out John Crocker-Bolteal, who was the manager and clerk of the course there just before the war, and he had some quite good ideas in terms of raising the standard of racing and the quality of racing. And he introduced the triumph hurdle, which became one of the main races for 4-year-olds over hurdles, and that race transferred after Hurst Park closed to Cheltenham, where it's run on the same day as the Cheltenham Gold Cup today. So he had lots of initiatives. Sadly, of course, for John Crocker-Bolteal, he came along in the late 1930s, and then the war intervened, and by that time his talents had been spotted by Ascot, and he moved on to Ascot Racecourse as their clerk of the course. But I think he was an innovator and did a lot to raise the standard. I mean, Hurst Park mustn't be talked down as not being a very good metropolitan racecourse.
Thank you for that. Similar to the question that I asked you before, if you had to pick which event in Hurst Park's or Sandown's history is the most defining moment for each racecourse, would you say?
Well, there are two things about Sandown. One is that they have these two meetings in the spring, one called the Grand Military Meeting and the other called the Royal Artillery Meeting, which are the principal meetings for soldier amateur riding. Although the military these days is no longer horsed, therefore less soldiers are taught to ride than they were years ago. It still keeps the tradition going and was a great favourite of the Queen Mothers. The other thing at Sandown Park is the Eclipse Stakes. The Eclipse Stakes was introduced in the 1880s and is named after Eclipse, one of the leading stallions in the early part of horse racing development, and is still run today on the first Saturday of July, and it is certainly one of the principal Group 1 races. You want me to say something about Hurst Park, I suppose? I was going to say, we've talked about the Triumph Hurdle. They used to also have a Grand National Trial, and the Victoria Cup, which was one of their big flat races, has moved to Ascot. There's still again run at Ascot today. Well, it would have been run in May this year, apart from the present problems.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Interesting how you mentioned Eclipse. Was he? I know that he was a really famous racehorse. Did he frequent Hurst Park or Sandown in the time that he was racing?
No, he didn't. Eclipse was foaled in 1764, and he died in 1789. During the time he won all 18 of his races. He was unbeaten. And he went on to be a very notable stallion, siring 862 winning horses, including 3 Derby winners. And of course, many of his progeny from those 862 became either brood mares or stallions in their own right. And so there are a huge number of horses that can be traced back to having Eclipse in their pedigree somewhere. So I think it was probably because of his reputation that Hoofer Williams chose to name a race after Eclipse. And again, it was a name that meant something for the status of Sandown Park. The value of the Eclipse Stakes when it was first introduced was £10,000, which was more valuable than the Epsom Derby.
Thank you so much for that. It's very interesting, and especially that, you know, probably so many of Eclipse's relatives have raced at Sandown or Hurst Park, even though you didn't.
Yeah.
I'm interested in also your personal memories of the two race courses. Could you, you know, give a bit of insight into what you remember of either Hurst Park or Sandown?
Yeah. Well, I was born in Hampton Court and brought up in Molesey, so Hurst Park was right on the doorstep, and I went racing there from quite a young age. And I remember watching the horses go across Greyburn Way and so forth. And as they did, I've said it, you know, the road was covered in peat. The peat was thrown up through those gates that are still there. And Sandown, I used to cycle over to Sandown with my father in the early days, and so I've been going racing. Well, I went racing at Hurst Park until it closed, and then obviously fairly young then, and then been going to Sandown ever since, along with a lot of other places.
Yeah, and what was the atmosphere like there when you used to attend?
I don't know if it's changed that much. I think the crowds were bigger for the reason I've said, that, you know, there was no betting shops in the 1950s, so getting to a course was the way to go to bet. I mean, you couldn't legally have a bet, as they either you had to have a credit account or go to the races. People did bet illegally, but it was obviously something that was a problem for most people, and so. I think the atmosphere, I think there were one or two of the characters have disappeared, which is probably something to do with people coming by car more these days to the races than they used to. I mean, I'm not sure these things would be seen as the nicest part of going racing, but you used to get people along the road doing the 3-card trick and trying to get money out of people for on their way walking down to the course and walking home again. I can remember right up until probably the 1970s, I can remember them hiding along the passageway down to Sandown or Esher Station, keeping an eye out for the police. And there was also people, I mean, Ras Prince Monolulu, who is famous as a tipster, although I don't think his tips were much good, used to be at the races, and there was other tipsters who used to be saying, you know, they would sell you a tip for a horse for a shilling or whatever in those days. Again, I shouldn't think the tips were a lot of good. They used to make out they had all the knowledge and in the know, but they really were just rascals. And they disappeared, partly probably because there was just no money in it, because everyone drove to the race. Therefore, you didn't get hordes of people walking along Hurst Road to get to the course, as they would have done in those days.
Thank you. And what would you say is your, I mean, I don't know whether you do have a kind of standout memory, but is there any day in particular which stands out to you in your memories of visiting these places?
I've always adored the Grand Military Meeting at Sandown, and it was equally adored, although not in quite the same way, I suspect, by the Queen Mother, who was a regular attendee at Sandown right up until the year she died, or the year before she died. And the Grand Military always had a lovely feel to it in terms of being amateur riders. Hurst Park, I think the thing that I remember was going into the centre of the course there with my father and having to cross over the course and seeing the fences close to hand and all of that, and the smell of the horses and so forth. But, you know, as I say, I've gotten so used to it now, it becomes a bit of a memory.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much.
No problem.
Just got a couple of final questions. This is a bit random, but reading about lots of famous visitors at Hurst Park, and especially the Queen Mother, I also read that something about Winston Churchill being involved in the racecourse. Is that something that you can elaborate on? Because I couldn't find anything about it.
Winston Churchill owned racehorses, and he had a very good horse called Colonist II, who raced at Sandown. So at Hurst Park, he may run at Sandown as well, but he definitely ran at Hurst Park. And Winston Churchill came to Hurst Park to see him run. And I think, you know, Winston Churchill was always interested in horses and so forth, so he had several over the years. And the royal family, of course, were connected in one way or another for many, many years.
Great. Thank you. Hurst Park had a lot of royal attendance over the years. I've put some photos up in our exhibition of you know, the Queen Mother and the Queen visiting in the 50s. Could you outline exactly why it shut down in 1962? Because it just seemed quite odd that it seemed very popular and then it suddenly shuts down.
Yeah, I think Hurst Park was very popular, and up until the introduction of betting shops in the beginning of the 1960s, the only way you could have a bet on horse racing was to either have a credit account with a bookmaker, which involved you having sort of deposited quite a lot of money, or by actually going to the races. And attendances at Hurst Park were very comparable with Sandown and Kempton and so forth, because people did go, especially for the midweek meetings. There was always a concern that when the betting shops came on the high street, it would affect racecourse attendances, and that has proved to be the case, particularly midweek. And I think what happened at Hurst Park was basically that the directors got an offer for building on the site that they couldn't refuse, and it was attractive to the shareholders to get rid of the course. By contrast, Sandown Park also could have been vulnerable in the 1960s, not necessarily from housing development, but from the building of the A3 bypass, because there was two routes, one from Paynes Hill in Cobham going through, as it does now, across Esher Common to Tolworth, but there was a second route proposed which would have gone through the back of Hersham and along parallel with the railway line and come out at the Scilly Isles roundabout, which would have taken away quite a lot of land from Sandown Park and would have made it much more difficult to continue to stage racing there.
I have no idea about that. Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because I think always kind of compare Sandown to Hurst Park, in that Sandown's the one that keeps going and Hurst Park's the one that gets closed and is like the unsuccessful one. But actually, you know, it's quite interesting that they're both in jeopardy at that time. Could you outline what physical remains, because obviously Hurst Park isn't there anymore, what kind of physical remains of Hurst Park can still be seen today if you're walking by or anyone's curious about might be seen?
I think the place to start is down by Greyburn Way, because the gates which were put up to cross for the horses to cross the road are still in situ, and obviously the width of those gates, the only thing that's really been changed on those gates is that the road level has been raised, because the gates now wouldn't shut because of the curbing and so forth has been done. But if you can get an idea of the width of the course by the side of those gates, and you can follow the line down towards Hampton Court. It doesn't go quite as far now as it used to go, because they built a few houses along Hurst Road at the end, but there's a house called Hurst End, which is where exactly the racecourse used to start beyond. And then you can follow the line of the straight across as far as you can walk before you get to the houses. And you can see the bend of the back straight as it comes around behind the cricket ground, because the cricket ground was there. There's less to see at the other end, mainly because of the building. Say Tesco's roughly is the point at where the winning post was. And if you walk round Ferry Road, the curbing of the road, when it becomes unmade up, is the original curbing that was there in the days of the racecourse, and is where the turnstiles would have been to go into the Silver Ring and so forth. And of course, the road along the back of the course was always there. And there would have been an entrance to the course where the ferry comes across from Hampton. And as I say, the bend of the course goes round, so you can get a pretty good idea of what it would have been like. But it obviously needs a bit of intuition. What I have done is I've superimposed a map of the racecourse as it was in the 1950s on top of a map of as it is today, so I can tie in pretty closely where everything was, and it obviously can be done by other people as well if they're interested in doing that, to get a real idea of what was where.
That's great, thank you. And I read about a while ago about the kind of outlines of the Hurst Park Racecourse could be seen from an aerial view. What happened there?
Well, I think what happened basically was the weather of whichever year it was, it's 2 or 3 years ago now, was an incredibly long dry spell. And it's on that section, as you come around Ferry Road, walking towards Hampton Church, where the parade ring would have been, at the back of where the horses walk around to parade before going out onto the course to race. And clearly it appears that the builders, because that little bit there wasn't built on, they didn't do much to excavate what was underneath before just letting it go to grass that you walk along now. And because it had a tarmac concrete base underneath, the grass has got a very shallow root level, and therefore when it got really, really dry, you could actually see the outline of the horse walk around the parade ring, because it was much lighter grass than the rest of what was there, all very parched in that summer.
That is amazing to think that, yeah. and that's still there.
So photos of that now, I took them there, and the Racing Post published one of them, actually put it under the headline "Hurst Parched" as opposed to Hurst.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to see that, even though it's not still standing there, like in times like that, you can still see, the physical remains of it.